Welcome and thank you for joining. This interview is part of a research article titled Ethical Risk of Generative AI in Education by Or Daniel and the advisor Dr. Rinat Rosenberg-Kima from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. The availability of the interview along with the scientific article can benefit both the scientific and education communities. The interview content was not edited, only noise and pauses were removed. We thank all subject matter experts for contributing their knowledge and experience to this study. A link to the article and ways to contact us will be added to the information of this interview. Interview number 3 with Professor Alberto Giovanni Busetto, held on November 14, 2023, in English. Enjoy.
I really appreciate it, Alberto. Thank you very much. So, let's start with the first question. Please just say your full name and what is your professional background and experience?
Yeah, I'm Alberto Giovanni Busetto. My professional background is certainly more than a decade of artificial intelligence applied to many different industry verticals. As well as in the research and development of artificial intelligence. So my background is in academia with a tenure-track assistant professorship at the University of California in Santa Barbara, after a PhD from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich on machine learning. And after that, I've been working in large corporations, as well as in various innovation initiatives, for instance, with Merck, the pharmaceutical science and technology company, where I've been the head of analytics, and with the Adecco Group in the area of HR, but also upskilling and reskilling, as Group Senior Vice President, Head of Data and AI.
So you have an amazing background, especially actually for this research, I think you can bring a lot of value. So in your view, what are the potential benefits or advantages of using generative AI technologies in education? Please list and describe all that come in mind.
There are many potential benefits and also benefits that have already been demonstrated. I would like to highlight a few things. The first one is that generative AI is very much a general purpose technology, even more so than, some people call it traditional AI, but more established AI. And so many of the benefits that you see in education are also similar to benefits that you would say in other application areas. That's an important consideration. And then another thing that I want to highlight is that generative AI, by contrast to statistical analysis, analytics, and then finally data science, is on top of that further amplifying, right, and making even more accessible what you can do in terms of benefits of AI technologies in general. But let me highlight some of the, I think, most important or impactful benefits. It's always difficult, to calibrate, in terms of overall volume, if you will, and overall impact, how much these things are, connected and related to each other. But certainly there is one important element that is particularly, developed in the case of generative AI, and that is that of personalized learning, right? So you can, for instance, create, or at least you can recommend some educational materials that are customized, and customized materials and experiences are arguably better at catering to the needs of the individuals, which are of course different, also to the different abilities, the different challenges, and also importantly, another thing that has been historically pretty much neglected is also the fact that people have different learning styles, and generative AI in that personalization allows to cater to the learning user. In this case, could be a student, also could be somebody who is actually moving from one career to another, or even better, in the context of lifelong learning. So what are the benefits of the personalization? Clearly, the experience becomes better. If you are measuring things with NPS scores, the NPS scores are increasing, right? The satisfaction increases. It's also lowering the barrier and the resistance to learning. It's making it easier to get adoption of learning technologies. And importantly, it can also be very engaging depending on how it's done. It can also inform better systems of incentives. And also finally, perhaps the most important thing, to also improve the learning outcomes. This is also something that, depending on how it's organized, can be also particularly beneficial. And in that personalization, so you have essentially two main, I would say, kind of final benefits. The first one then is the personalization of the experience and hopefully the better outcomes of learning. And then also the fact that, it's lowering the cost to deploy things and to build products, which is important, so that, you have the double benefit potentially of improving outcomes and at the same time keeping costs contained or even lowering them. This, I think, is a big one. It's a big kind of benefit and an application area of generative AI in education. The second one, which is connected with this one, is also the ability to generate content very easily. One has always to, when it comes to content generation, one also has to always take also quality into account, right? It remains unclear today whether this capacity, right, for the multiplication of the volume also corresponds to an overall increase in quality, right? This is an open question, but certainly the potential to create content at scale, to do it very rapidly, to do it in a way that is very cost effective, and also that can cover a very wide range of educational content is something which is desirable. What are the examples of content creation that are worth kind of mentioning? Interactive lessons, interactive lectures. Importantly, also not only kind of the more passive aspects of this, but rather also the ability to practice actually exercises, having visual aids, having many channels to learn, all connected in a meaningful way. So this, I think, is something that can help with learning, and also it's helping the educators save time, importantly, using resources more effectively, both for in-person, like planning and teaching, and also for the material development in general, regardless of whether this is delivered through a digital channel or even in person or in a classroom. So this is also connected, the content creation part is also connected to another element which I think is very important and very valuable. Generative AI is very often delivered through agents, chatbots, for instance, and also chatbots, like operating through voice and other channels. When you're engaging with a chatbot that is generative AI, kind of empowered, you are also opening the door to targeted and potentially very helpful systems of assessment and feedback. Checking whether somebody is able to learn well or not is very time consuming. It's something that requires significant attention and something that requires a significant time, right? Now, depending on how AI and generative AI in this case is delivered, and depending on the quality of the content, it's possible to imagine that personalized feedback to students, to lifelong learners, and so on, can really guide them in their learning journey. And so, in doing that, it's enabling them, of course, to understand also what is the level of progress, right? And what is the current status, and also to highlight what are the areas for improvement, potentially even in real time. Now, another benefit I think that is important is related to equity and accessibility. So generative AI has the potential, depending on how it's built and deployed, to make learning materials, for instance, available in multiple languages. It's always easier, of course, to learn things for people in their native language, and it's also true that the global population is sometimes, in some cases, excluded, right, from access to educational material, because language is of course making human culture rich, but can also be a barrier to learning, right? It's a barrier to communication, also a barrier to learning. So having things that can be translated very easily in multiple languages, also in multiple formats, right, would be able to cater to a very different audience, either by geography or also by, ways of learning, right? Because people, also learn in very different ways. We need to acknowledge that. And also in different formats, right? Different formats are also, something that, has to be taken into account. So in other words, the benefit, that it would bring to students is it makes it accessible for people with different backgrounds, educational, cultural backgrounds, also different levels of education, potentially also for students with disabilities. So it's also, potentially a technology that is inclusive, right, in its potential.
So that's good. So we have a lot of advantages and benefits. So I think jumping to the next question will give us the entire perspective. So the next question is, what do you see as the main risk, challenges, or ethical concerns associated with the educational uses of generative AI? Of course, it's the education field.
Yeah. Clearly, every technology and every process, right, and everything new, perhaps even more generally, has potential risks, right, that should be mitigated in a way that is responsible. And every time, of course, one is taking risks into account. It's also important to kind of address that in terms of mitigation strategies. I guess we'll be covering that later. But let me now focus on the risks, right? What are the risks? So I think a very significant risk is related to to quality assurance, essentially, and the quality of the material that is being provided. Clearly, education and learning are beneficial to humanity as long as what is being learned and what is being taught is indeed truthful and also useful. Perhaps one could even say, and also kind. So this is, I think, a significant risk. Generative AI is, as a class of capabilities, is very new. Although it has been developing very rapidly, it is not a mature technology yet. It might be and might become mature in the years to come. But today, of course, there are kind of quality concerns, right, regarding the truthfulness of the content that is being generated, regarding the type of relationships between, say, cause and effect, for instance, or because or other types of formal and epistemological kind of relationships between elements, right, and content that is generated, and clearly, quality assurance is potentially a significant risk, I would say. Quality of knowledge is at the core, right, of the educational system. So it's this is a core risk, if you will. There are also other risks, right, that are connected more or less directly to this. The first one, for instance, is also the potential for misuse of data, right? So personalization is always a fantastic opportunity to make things relevant for individuals, right? But in practice, personalization also means processing data that are personal, and they might contain sensitive attributes, right, or sensitive elements that need to be taken into consideration. So there are data privacy considerations. It is not clear in general, right, if you have access to this data, whether subsequent use, right, of a certain kind of data set and so on are necessarily in line with the initial kind of purpose and content, right? This is something that has to be ensured, and in other words, are the data being, protected in a way that is robust, responsible, and trustworthy? And is it going to be used, say, today and tomorrow for purposes that are other than those that were intended? For instance, one can always take the obvious examples of, targeted advertising or profiling of various kinds and so on, and even accidental misuse, right? Accidental misuse is also another risk. And more generally, I would categorize that into the family of risks of unintended consequences, like every new technology, because it is new, obviously, might produce unintended negative consequences. Some of them we can foresee, and many others that we cannot foresee. And nonetheless, of course, we need to do, in general, as humans and professionals in this area, quite some research, right, on what are the potentially today unknown unintended consequences, and of course, the known ones.
Yes, but I have a question about it, Alberto. But these accidents that we don't know what happened with the generative AI in use in education, we supposed to have maybe consequences, negative consequences. But within education, we're talking about children. So are the risks worth using generative AI in education if we don't know what accident could happen?
I can. I don't have the answer to this question. I think it deserves. It certainly deserves attention. Education, from the way I see it, is education for everybody. Now, of course, one has always to be especially careful, right? In the case of children, obviously. I can imagine among the more or less unintended consequences, for instance, is that using generative AI, like many other digital technologies, might create a certain kind of dependency, right?
Yes.
For instance, because people are used to learn in a certain way, a certain dependency on the technology, right? For instance, like making people, kind of excessively reliant on the AI tools.
It's not similar to...
What is the effect? Yeah.
It's similar to calculator. It's amplify our abilities.
It is... of course, there are these stories that when the writing was introduced, then, like people were asking themselves, are we going to lose our memory, right? Because now we can write everything, we don't need to memorize. Yes, there are, trade-offs in terms of benefits, and perhaps it is true that some abilities of, memorizing, for instance, significant amount of content are perhaps, slightly reduced, or at least, done in a different way. This calculation, I think, the only way to address it is in an experimental and well-controlled setting to see whether indeed that's the case or not. And I would say that today, in general, at least to the best of my knowledge, we don't have the answer to these questions, but these are questions that you should definitely ask.
Thank you very much about that. This is the most important thing that you said about risk. It's the accident, that we don't know what the consequences of using AI and generative AI in education. A lot of things can happen, and we don't know. And when I ask, it's scary a little bit, because now we can see it in the education system all around the world. Let's use ChatGPT, let's use other tools, and let's put them in the curriculum, and they use it.
Yeah, there is. I think every time a new technology, right, or a new way of doing things is introduced, it's always to manage, right, also known unknowns and unknown unknowns. It's always important to do some good monitoring, right? So I think one important element, and maybe I will cover that a little bit in the kind of mitigation strategies part when we discuss that later. I think the only way to find out right things is to do the monitoring in a good way. Right. Of course, to be responsible from the very beginning, but also to account for the unknown, right? Which means being able to test, hypotheses, to evaluate if there are outliers, to assess whether there are unintended consequences. We mentioned one that was, the potential kind of increase in the dependency on technology. There are also others that are this I would say is to a large extent an unknown. But there are also others that are known unknowns today. Generative AI, like many, kind of machine learning based technologies, and even some types of kind of statistical techniques, might actually reinforce certain stereotypes. And this is also another element, right, which is now understood. We can see that very clearly in image generation, in content generation for text, and so on. Reinforcing stereotype is dangerous. One could even say, generally speaking, a very negative kind of outcome. It is known to happen, right? and due to the, among other things, bias, but also simplicity, right, of the models that are being used, or as I mentioned before, even we know generative AI systems can also provide information that is not accurate, and that is already by itself not a good thing. That of the stereotypes is maybe one potential manifestation of that. And then finally, maybe there is another element depending on how generative AI is being used, right? The answer to most of these questions is it depends, right? Because it depends on how things are done. But things that we can foresee, for instance, and this is a little bit kind of the polar opposite of personalization, is if generative AI is used not to personalize things in a good way, then an over-reliance on this technology might actually lead to kind of mass production. I'm saying that a little bit in a negative way, mass production and a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Which means that you're potentially with a technology like this, the risk is that, the unique needs, right, or preferences of, or even the learning styles of individuals are being, kind of considered secondary, because clearly once, like a certain kind of product is being designed, there is also a limit to the personalization, and this is also a limit in terms of cost, time dedicated to it, ability of, designers to take these things into account, and so on.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Let's jump to the next question about, so what recommendation would you have for policymakers regarding regulating or providing guidance on generative AI in education?
I think there are two main elements to be discussed here. The first one is to identify what is now already covered by existing standards, regulations, including voluntary standards and regulations, legislations, and so on, that is applicable to generative AI. Many things are already in many jurisdictions already quite well codified by law. Very clear examples of this are typically, non-discrimination, right? Discrimination is a bad thing regardless of whether this is done by a generative AI system or by a person or an AI system that's non-generative, or even a simple, software system that has no AI elements. So existing legislations will probably cover quite a lot, right? And it's always kind of much better to enforce, like in a good way, what is already there, to make it consistent, to avoid duplication, because I believe that societies and organizations work better when there are few rules, but these rules are also very clear, and they're also applied in a way that is, balanced and just. So to kind of avoid the duplication, overlaps, and all kind of loopholes, the most important thing would be at the beginning to say, hey, what is already existing, and to which extent are existing, rules, including voluntary standards, technical standards, laws, and so on, and even most importantly, charters, like human rights and so on. How are these things kind of applicable to generative AI in education? But then clearly there are also some specific kind of aspects of generative AI that are worth considering, because they either change the scale or the magnitude or the level of how accessible the technology is. And I would say maybe the most important, if I had to probably take the four most important points, they would be the ability to ensure that there is equity and access to the technology. So to make sure that essentially students and all those that want to learn, so prospective students as well, they can benefit from this regardless of their background, regardless of their situation, regardless of potentially a disability or another kind of personal attribute, right? So if we don't do it, I think as a society we are risking quite a lot, because generative AI is in terms of its potential is significant, right? And the risk is that we are widening, the educational divide. so that only certain types of students have access to advanced AI tools rather than everybody. That's one thing. The second one is already to a very large extent covered by existing, legislations, or at least in general. Clearly, the use of artificial intelligence, generative AI or not, in education is involving the collection, also the analysis of quite a lot of data, right? Personal data. So there are, important considerations regarding privacy and security, and also the robustness, right, of these systems. And then another important element, which is, I would say, in part already covered by existing, regulations, but which of course should be clarified, is of course, the bias and the fairness. So clearly, the algorithms, right, in general, and generative AI perhaps in particular, they can sadly perpetuate, or amplify existing biases. And this is especially true if they are trained on data sets that are skewed or unrepresentative, or somehow, you might say, undesirable or defective in some sense. And then, importantly, although this is often not easy to implement in practice, is the transparency and accountability aspects, right? There is a need for transparency, I would say, in general in society, but generative AI systems, they make important decisions in a way that might or might not be clear and transparent. And it's not always clear who is, accountable for the outcomes, especially if there are, the risks that we mentioned before. So in practice, then, beyond kind of the regulatory part, there is also a lot, that developers and managers and producers of these systems can do in terms of mitigation strategies.
What suggestions, in the current situation with the technology, right, would you have for educators and administrators in education systems that looking to integrate generative AI into curricula or institutions? So what you will offer to them to do? So any suggestions?
Yeah, I think maybe the main suggestion is for the educators to be educated about generative AI as well. Clearly, this is a new technology, right? It's a new way of doing things, and it's something which is, one could claim, truly unprecedented, right, in our human history. Educators are, generally speaking, highly educated by definition and by construction, and so they have certainly the tools to educate themselves and kind of also proactively, aim at understanding, what are the potential benefits that we mentioned before? Also, what are the potential limits, right? Clearly, there is an element of, some people call it the human touch, the human kind of engagement and interaction with students that, with us being human beings rather than machines, I find it hard, right, to kind of certainly replace or at least kind of do in a different way. It is, I think, a desirable outcome, right, for educators to be empowered by technology, for students to be empowered by technology, and for the whole kind of educational system to leverage these things within the limits of what is wise, I would say, and positive. Now, in practice, what it means to me is to have, on a voluntary but also in a structural way, to have education programs for educators, for teachers, for educators of all kinds, to make it easy and to reward efforts in this direction. It's imaginable, right, that educators are very much also motivated by their willingness to learn and to kind of share that learning with others. But it's also important because we are talking about potentially very large organizations, that systems are also in place so that this type of efforts are rewarded, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be a financial rewarding, but really also, although it could certainly be, but really kind of creating an environment where these things are kind of appreciated, and it is possible for people to invest their time in understanding these things. And then I would also kind of encourage for them to focus on a few aspects. Now, if I have to think about what are the main aspects, right, that are important for educators to know, the first one is understanding the limitations, right, of the systems that are using, the limitations regarding the quality of the content, and perhaps even to take that as an opportunity to put even more the emphasis on the critical thinking. Critical thinking, I choose to believe, and I genuinely believe is a quality that deserves our attention, our investment as society, and perhaps even will determine like the future of humanity. So critical, independent, analytical thinking are valuable. Generative AI is an opportunity actually to do more of that. Clearly, also to understand what are the limits of inclusion and equity. So to make sure that for instance, when they're teaching and educating others, they understand that they have in front of them many different types of learners. There are people with different ways of learning. There are some with disabilities, like developmental learning disabilities, and also different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. I think this is an important element to adhere and to kind of educate themselves on also what are the ethical guidelines, right, and what are the standards, right, for data processing and for the responsible use of digital technologies, regardless of whether it's generative AI or not. And then finally, I think there's another element that educators should take into account is to keep that level of human oversight, right, on the technology. So balancing essentially the interaction with the AI system, also with some human interaction as well, and to do that in a way that is also ensuring and evaluating and assessing whether certain recommendations, certain content, certain decisions are appropriate and beneficial and desirable in that sense.
That's great. So I have another question about this answer, but I will keep it in the end. Let's see if we can manage the time. Mm-hmm. So the next question, in your opinion, under what circumstances is the use of generative AI in educational setting appropriate and ethical acceptable, and when would it be inappropriate or unethical?
This is a complex question, right? Because it depends. I mean, for each one of the elements that you mentioned, there are many possible answers. But I would say, generally speaking, it is ethical and appropriate and desirable when generative AI is used to increase the quality of the content, to increase to augment the ability of students to learn, and when this is done in a way that is equitable and inclusive. I think these are the three kind of main elements. So there is an element of quality and outcomes. There's an element of efficiency, right, in terms of time, resources, and also there's an element of fairness, equity, and inclusion. I think these are the three kind of pillars, right, of what would make it desirable and acceptable. The counterpart to that are, in a way, kind of the polar opposite of these things, right? When you have a technology that is increasing the divide, that is leaving people behind, this is clearly undesirable, and I would say even unethical. When the quality of the content, and as a consequence, the quality of the outcomes is worse, even when that can bring some, kind of benefit in terms of resources, is still, in my opinion, at least not acceptable. So a degradation of the quality and of the outcomes is absolutely undesirable and should be avoided. And clearly, when the technology is also kind of leading to unintended consequences to students, teachers, or society, like for instance, creating an excessive dependency on the technology, or other unintended consequences that we discussed before. Reinforcing stereotypes. For instance, compromising, the quality, as I mentioned before, or also kind of, in a way, impoverishing not only the experience, but also especially the ability to think critically.
Okay, that's great. So I have another question. We have two more, don't worry. So in your opinion, how should educators and policymakers assess the risk associated with generative AI? And why this is important is this question is crucial. I will explain a little bit, because when you use generative AI or any other technology in education, it's kids, right? You can affect them long term. You don't know the accidents that could happen, what you said earlier, how it will affect their development, right? It's different between young people and adults. So here, before educators or before policymakers put these machines, right, in education, how they can assess the risk. Is there any way to do that before using it?
This is a difficult question, and I'm not necessarily an expert, right, especially in early education. Although I've worked actually on AI systems actually for developmental learning disabilities, for instance, for the treatment of dyslexia and dyscalculia, or at least kind of the management of some of these aspects. So I leave, the indicators and the quantitative, KPIs, of course, to the experts that I'm not. But clearly, there are at least two things that should be done. The first one is to have review boards before a certain technology is deployed on a large scale, in a way that is similar to what is being done in, one could say, healthcare, right, and pharma and kind of medical, technologies. There are certainly kind of review boards that are at least able to pinpoint a few of the potential known unknowns and known potential kind of negative outcomes, right? This is to take a precautionary approach. And then the second one is to actually measure things on the ground, to run controlled experimentation whenever this is possible. And in cases in which controlled experimentation is not possible because it's technically not feasible, or because it will be unethical to test things, to at least get an approximation of that by using observational causal analysis. And so that kind of level of controlled in some cases and observational kind of experimentation is important. There is another risk, right, in all of these things that should be managed in a good way, and this is often a pitfall that I've seen in confusing essentially metrics of success with goals and objectives. Teaching to the test is perhaps the ultimate kind of example of this, right? Something which I find undesirable, where a certain kind of measure, for instance, of quality in learning becomes then only an objective. And, there is the Goodhart's law that says that, as it has been observed many times, that says that informally, a good measure cannot be, a good objective, or something that is an objective can hardly be a good measure. Clearly, intentionally and unintentionally, there are plenty of individuals or organizations that could game the system. This is something that has to be taken into account so that one can be smart about this and avoid that kind of paradoxical and undesirable situation. So in summary, if I had to to summarize that in 3 sentences, that would be: the first one is review boards before things are deployed. and then experimentation, controlled experimentation whenever this is possible, and observational causality analysis as a substitute for that. And then finally, avoiding mixing measures of success with objectives.
Any other perspectives you would like to share regarding the ethics of generative AI in education? Something that maybe we didn't talk about?
There is another element that I want to highlight. I think it can be useful as an indication. It has ethical implications, although it is something that in general is in between, you might say, kind of management science and management of innovation. I think it applies to generative AI in education because it is a new technology, and in that sense, it is innovation now on the ground, and it's this one. Very often, when new analytical or quantitative technologies are deployed and they start, like being used, there is of course a good enthusiasm, right, which is desirable because people, pick up that kind of way of doing things that is very much driven by data and hopefully driven by evidence, right? I think the best kind of way of thinking about that is to, acknowledge that how can you make things better? In this case, we want to make education better, right? If you don't measure things, right? One can hardly make things better without measuring them, right? This is what is being said very often, which I think has a lot of truth. But without a good education on how the technology works, without a very good understanding on how society would interact with that technology as a socio-technical kind of engagement, then the easier it is to throw ourselves, of course, with the best intentions, right? But throw ourselves in a type of engagement that is not necessarily the most meaningful or the best. And the way, one of the many reasons why this happens is because it's very easy to fall into what is called the McNamara's fallacy of over-relying on things that we can measure, indicators, KPIs, things that would actually be generated, in this case, by generative AI, and neglecting all the other indicators that are not easily accessible or at least not easy to measure. And to forget that these other measures should also be taken into account, maybe as categorical, like measurements, or maybe with a grain of salt, which is also equally as important. And so to avoid actually only relying on decision making on the basis of things that we can measure, inexpensively, but also to take, the whole picture into account and to exercise prudence and wisdom in this. And finally, one kind of element that is connected to this, and it's a strong recommendation, is to always keep in mind that things that are quantitative in nature might, but also might not be always objective. And I think this is also kind of a risk, right? It's connected with the truthfulness, right, of the content that's being generated. It's connected with a bias, right, that is, produced by algorithms, by unbalanced data sets. And I think it is the greatest risk if done poorly, or maybe the greatest opportunity for generative AI in education, as it has been for many other technologies.
That's a great addition to the interview. So I want to actually go back. It's also connected to what you actually answered now, but I want to go back, and you said that critical thinking will determine the future of humanity, right? The skill of critical thinking. But you said it in correlation to AI, probably generative AI. What you said right now, bias, you said deep fakes, probably, the quality of information. So you're actually, the benefits and the disadvantages, right, and the risk. So this is the benefits, but as humanity, we'll probably use it for, maybe not always amazing way, right? So you said that critical thinking is so important. So if you would be the one that's responsible for, I don't know, the UN, the OECD that decide on massive use of AI, would you agree to use it? tomorrow morning in every school, or you will use it first to help design critical thinking? I don't know. What would you do?
This is not an easy question to answer because it's, of course, well, hypothetical, and of course, like it would have, very, very profound implications. But maybe if I can answer that in a way, I would say it like this. I would certainly encourage teachers and educators to include elements, or even to, like in a supervised way, of course, and in a responsible way, to use generative AI to generate content and to stimulate creativity and critical thinking. I would use that as an opportunity to generate multiple outputs, right? Clearly different, systems would allow, a certain control for some people call it creativity, and other people call it, computational temperature and entropy, right, of the answer. I would use that to generate more than one output, and I would use that as material to make a critique, to make a comparison, to evaluate different scenarios, to evaluate different perspectives, and to stimulate critical thinking as well as creative thinking. The power of generative AI is, among other things, that you can generate quite a lot of content relatively inexpensively. That ability of multiplying the volume and of also, controlling the entropy of the generated content is a fantastic opportunity to train critical thinking, something that is, I think, important, especially today, and it's, I believe, also important for the future of humanity. This would be something where you essentially, as a scenario, something where you encourage, right, the critical use of generative AI as an opportunity to make comparisons, to evaluate, to stimulate a discussion, and to do that at scale.
And you also actually, in between the sentences, you actually also develop critical thinking by letting them evaluate what the content that generative AI has created, right? So that's amazing. So Alberto, thank you very much for the interview. I hope it was enjoyable for you also.
For sure. Many thanks for being here. A pleasure.
I really appreciate it. So just don't close this window until we finish. Alberto, do you approve this recording will also be as a part of the research and be accessible to everyone?
I approve that.
Okay, thank you.